The Holy Gospel according to John, the first chapter.
Glory to you, Lord.
There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He himself was not the light, but he came to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. This is the testimony given by John when the Jews sent priests and Levites from Jerusalem to ask him, "Who are you?" He confessed and did not deny it, but confessed, "I am not the Messiah." And they asked him, "What then? Are you Elijah?" He said, "I am not." "Are you the prophet?" He answered, "No." Then they said to him, "Who are you? Let us have an answer for those who sent us. What do you say about yourself?" He said, "I am the voice of one crying out in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord,' as the prophet Isaiah said." Now they had been sent from the Pharisees. They asked him, "Why then are you baptizing if you are neither the Messiah, nor Elijah, nor the prophet?" John answered them, "I baptize with water. Among you stands one whom you do not know, the one who is coming after me. I am not worthy to untie the thong of his sandal." This took place in Bethany across the Jordan, where John was baptizing. The gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
You may be seated. As we have been making our way through these Sundays and weeks of Advent, the church has been focusing, and our scriptures have been focusing on our work of waiting. That first week we received the promise from the second reading, a promise that we have all the spiritual gifts that we need, that we have what it takes to do this work of waiting and watching. And last week we talked a little bit about one of those spiritual gifts, that of patience. And we talked a little bit about what it was that God calls the faithful to be doing in those times of waiting. We talked about prayer and meditation and ways of calming ourselves when we have a tendency towards becoming anxious. But we also talked about doing something, being active, and indeed serving others in that time of waiting. So this week, as we come to this third week, we hear an invitation, a call to rejoice always, to rejoice with all of our being. Indeed, in the first reading, we heard a call to be aware that God is doing a new thing, turning weeping and mourning into gladness. That there is a time of renewal that is happening among God's people. And we hear in the gospel reading John announcing that, first of all, he is not the one, but he came to testify to that one, to point towards the one who was in our midst already. We're invited to perceive that one, to see that one. And in the psalm, we heard invitations to joy. Now, I don't know about you, but when I think about rejoicing, I think about times of celebration and great joy. Perhaps it's a bit like, I don't know, the celebration after you've won the state championship, or at some other time. The challenge is those kinds of experiences, Those kinds of experiences are filled with lots of energy and maybe some hooping and hollering and hugging and thanksgiving and all kinds of incredible, powerful, even ecstatic kinds of expressions of joy. Now, maybe it's just because I'm getting a little bit more chronologically gifted, but I find it hard to think about being in that kind of a state always. So when I hear rejoice always, this past week I found myself thinking about, well, what else could that mean? What other shapes could rejoicing look like? So what I want to do is ask you to take just a moment now and think about times that are filled with joy that could be identified as times for rejoicing in your life. And what are the variety of shapes that rejoicing takes? It seems to me that it's not always about hooping and hollering and being all energetic. There are other ways to rejoice. Take a moment. You know what's coming next. Find 2 or 3 other people that you can gather in a small group with and talk about those experiences, what those times are. Looking at me quizzically. So what kinds of things did you come up with? Maybe circumstances or actions or what? What does rejoicing look like? How can it take different shapes? Okay, so at the death of a suffering person, there can be kind of some joy in knowing that they have come to that place of rest, huh? We pray, rest eternal grant them. Yeah.
Recovery from very serious illness.
Okay, so recovery from illness. Okay, there can be rejoicing then. So what do those, I'm thinking that in both of those, well, particularly in the first, there isn't a lot of dancing necessarily, that it's tempered a bit, right? And so we rejoice, but it's a different kind of rejoicing. Okay. Others? Okay, the birth of a baby, particularly if you're mom, right? If you're the mother of that baby, I'm thinking that rejoicing is not about jumping up and down and dancing, right? Maybe more like, or the birth of a grandchild, huh? Yeah. Memory? Okay. All right. Others? Do I have to walk back there to get responses from back there? We're excited that the first semester is almost done. One of the things that I found myself thinking about was that, I don't know if some of you remember 4 years ago, about the time that I showed up, those first few Sundays, for me, worship here is so vibrant and vital and filled with energy, and it was like dancing everywhere and walking on air, right? So that's kind of that high celebration. And now, all of that's true, but, I couldn't sustain that. And so the truth of the matter is we've come into a different kind of relationship where that joy and that rejoicing and the opportunity to gather for worship is different. It may be similar to, if you can remember, for those who are married, if you can remember when you started to realize that the one you were dating was it. And there's that lightness, right? But as the marriage goes on, then the joy and the rejoicing and the life together takes a different shape. It's not any less rejoicing, right? But it takes a different shape. And so what I invite us to think about is the way in which when Paul calls us to rejoice always, what we heard today in our second reading is the very last instructions that Paul gives to that community at Thessalonica. He has been writing for quite a while and encouraging that congregation to be faithful in the face of kind of a difficult situation, a situation that would easily call them to not be terribly faithful. And so now we get to the very last verses of the very last chapter of this letter, and we get all of these imperatives, commands. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances. And he goes on with testing the Spirit and doing the things that are good and show forth God's grace, and avoiding doing the things that are contrary to God, doing evil. Avoid the evil. But then there comes a blessing, and the blessing is a blessing of God's presence and God's love. And so when we live in that, the call is that as we rejoice, as we pray constantly, we tend to the relationship that we have with God that is already there, not by any doing of our own, but rather by God's choosing us and claiming us. But as we name and continue that relationship in the process of prayer, then when we're in the bright and sunny and wonderful times, as well as in those times that are more challenging and difficult, we can recognize God is present with us. And when we see the face of God, we recognize the ways that God is sustaining us. And we can give thanks no matter what the circumstance, in the high times and in the low times. And when we live a life that is grounded in that kind of an attitude of rejoicing, by the way, I believe it's no accident that Zion Lutheran Church leads with rejoicing in our mission statement. When we live in that posture, that attitude, that way of being that is rejoicing and praying and giving thanks, then we join John the Baptizer in bearing witness to the light that has come and is present and is promised to come again, Jesus Christ.